Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on cybersecurity challenges in the IoT area. My name is Michael Drescher, and I will be your host and webinar director, if you like, for today. We're happy to present to you some first results of our cyberwatching.eu project in collaboration with the projects Anastasia and F2C and Create IoT. Let's dive right in. Our agenda for today is featuring a bit of an introduction of me on the background, what we are doing, why we are doing it, and then we dive straight into applications of IoT and cybersecurity, starting with Dr. Jens Jensen from UKRI's STFC for the MF2C project. After that, we will have a talk of Dr. Pasquale Anicino from the Create IoT project on privacy and security in IoT. After that, we'll have a brief Q&A session for you to raise questions and for the two presenters to give answers. If you raise the questions during the presentation, we will see to that the presenters, that the panelists will see to answer them. If not, we will do that in this Q&A. The same will go for then after that Dr. Antonio Scarmetta from University of Murcia for Anastasia project, and for Anastasia Bozzi from ICT Legal from the cyberwatching.eu project. After that, we will have again a quick Q&A session for those two presentations. And then I'll have some closing remarks and some further material and webinars and events for you to look at. So let's have a look. We have in total 50 registrants, and I see a lot of people are coming already to the call. We have I think for our domain, a very good distribution. We have about a third female registrants, which is very good. Most of our registrants come from Europe, with some from Asia, Americas, and from Africa. So we have a fairly nice worldwide spread. Most of you appear to come from the consulting and software business, telecommunications, and even government, with some legal education, retail, and other verticals that are interested in this topic. The main interests that people see for today is learning about the clustering, how we did it, how we arrived to matching the projects, looking into practical tools that I can take away from this webinar and from other sources of information to learn best practices, and last but not least, to become part of the cybersecurity communities, which is a very good motivation to go further. So the cyberwatching.eu project is a communications and support action from funded by the European Commission in H 2020, and our overall overarching mission and objective is to provide all the projects that do topical and technical research in this area, in the cybersecurity area, with means of connecting, communication, and generally matching up and connecting them with the user communities and things like that. Our keywords are, of course, technology, policies and standards, engagement, and go-to-market support for the projects. Looking at the EU cybersecurity research landscape from the last 15 years, there were 180 projects that have been funded that are still running. Some of them are still running with a budget of nearly 800 million euros spanning that area. Now, the question with that is, how do you make sense of such a broad landscape or spectrum of topics? How do you cluster that? How do you gain oversight of that? And that's exactly what we did. We did it in this way, first of all, to get a high-level overview and an oversight of which projects are there, in which state are they there, when is it the right time to engage with the projects, and when are these projects perhaps out of date? Because, as you know, every project has a life cycle, every software has a life cycle. As requirements and development, you move on. So at some point, you have to sunset your attention on project outcomes to see whether they're still relevant for you. And this is exactly what the technology radar does. It provides you an overview of projects, separated or clustered, grouped by various different taxonomy terms. I come to that later. And then we do dig it a little bit deeper in using statistical methodologies to actually do some sort of matchmaking for projects, seeing that where do we find commonalities of the projects purely based on statistical analysis of the project's main focus. And after that, We look at analyzing how ready are they actually in their planned and actually realized progress through their technology stack, if they do technology, and their market readiness in terms of how well have they prepared their outcomes to be taken up by the markets, either by themselves through business and operations processes and infrastructure, or by preparing the software, the stack, and other materials that they have for a third-party update. And then we support the projects in going to the market. Cyberwatching.eu operates a marketplace on which we connect the projects with their target verticals, where the project can self-manage their little presence on the marketplace, and interested consumers of the technology and outputs can search for them and then have a matchmaking, among others. So to make sense of all these projects and see how they go, we have a two-level category, a two-level taxonomy. The first one is a broad categorization on technical methods and risk management. Then applications and user-oriented services, largely technical taxonomy term, and then policy, governance, ethics, and trust, and among some others. And these three categories are then further split up into two subcategories, or level 2 terms, if you like, which we use to cluster the projects. And I'll tell you a bit later how we do that. So the first thing that we need to do, obviously, is to collect all the base data of the projects, their names, what's their budget, when they start, when they end, titles, URLs, and all this kind of base or core data of projects to actually know what we are talking about. What we then do is, using the technology radar, this is a live screenshot. If you go to the cyberwatching.eu project website, you'll get a link to that radar to try it out for yourself. And what we do with the projects is to categorize or rank our second level taxonomy terms, which we use to cluster projects, in order of importance for the project. So you will see that we have 6 level 2 taxonomy terms, and we rank those 6 terms for each project. Some projects might only have apply or maybe covered under one taxonomy term. Some projects, although that's very rare, might be covered under all 6, and then we rank them. And with that, we use that information for the technology radar to gain that oversight. You see the 6 segments of the circular radar. These represent the 6 level 2 taxonomy terms. And the information in that technology radar is linked back to what we do in the third step, the readiness of the project, and the color coding is directly reflected to that. But let's talk about it at a later time or in another webinar. What we do then next is actually what we do for this webinar is we take the ranking of all 6 taxonomy terms and do a statistical analysis that is known as principal component analysis, where we look at how correlating are these taxonomy terms across the projects. And that gives us a clustering. You see 2 fairly technical diagrams. On the left-hand side, you see a dendrogram, which is a statistical analysis and visualization of how close projects are to each other. And this is the main source of how we formed the 5 clusters. And on the right-hand side, you see a 2-dimensional projection of, in this case, effectively a 6-dimensional space in which project blips, and in this case numbers, sort of cluster together. A lot of people can't think in 6 dimensions. I can't either. So the mapping on the 2 most important dimensions is done through this biplot. It's called a biplot, and there you see the correspondence of the clusters that we have on the left-hand side to how they correlate on the right-hand side. And there you see, for example, that there's a high correlation or high overlap of verification and assurance and operational risk and analysis in projects that we have analyzed. And that is it's not surprising. The same goes for human aspects of cybersecurity and national and international security and governance. These are related topics, and you see clear clusters on that. And the same goes for for the remaining 2 taxonomy level 2 terms. And this is the basis on how we have clustered the projects. And this is again the basis for how we approached projects to invite them, present the results to interested parties, to you on the webinar, to see whether that's of interest for you and to further engage and collaborate with the projects and with you. And with that, I shall stop babbling and introduce our speakers. The first one is Dr. Jens Jensen from STFC in the United Kingdom for the MF2C project. Our second speaker is Dr. Pasquale Anicino from the Create IoT project. After that, we will have a quick Q&A, and then Dr. Antonio Scarmeta for the Anastasia project will give you insights. And then as a closing speaker will be Anastasia Bozzi from ICT Legal from our own project from cyberwatching.eu. And with that, thank you so far, and let's dive straight into the first presentation from Jens Jensen.
Jens, I think you're muted. So
okay, yeah,
you're
right.
Now we can hear you loud and clear. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, thanks very much. I seem to have muted when I moved it. Okay, so we identified challenges such as trust and reputation of Internet of Things. So we've all heard stories about stuff that has gone wrong in the Internet of Things. We've got lots of legacy stuff out there that is already out there, and you can't really change it because it's out there. There are barriers to building new applications. If you've ever tried programming a microcontroller, you're effectively building an operating system for it with interrupts and all kinds of things. So it is a bit daunting for beginners to get started. And then keeping it secure. Once you build your Internet of Things devices, how do you make sure that it stays secure? Particularly given these humans who tend to try to use it and often are the weak points because they choose weak passwords and stuff. So the premise of MF2C is to build a platform that will do the edge to fog to cloud applications. So one of the typical applications that I've found is sensor networks. So you have sensors close to the edge that deliver data, and then you can process that close to the edge if necessary, or if you need more computing services, or if you need to share data with others, then you push it towards the cloud. And we have 3 use cases that keep us honest. Building sensors that sit in buildings and check whether there are earthquakes and the buildings are falling down. Smart boats, where boats communicate with each other to test whether they're drifting or whether they are, maybe they can relay communications via each other if they're out of reach. And finally, an airport hub. So when you travel through airports, it tells you when to go to gate, and if you have time, whether you want to shop or something. Maybe you want to buy the things that were confiscated in security. So the idea generally is that we do computation as close to the edge as possible, and by building a platform, we make it easier to develop applications. And what it looks like, if you start from the bottom layer with networks, so all of the layers, edge, fog, and cloud, have networks. They rely on communicating with each other. Then you have a stack of web services kind of things. Then there are more advanced features like execution of tasks and monitoring whether the tasks are executed correctly. And this bit in the middle is what we call the platform. And then you can go and build your application on top of that, which may sit some bits on the edge and bits on the in the fog. So if we look at the architecture of the platform, it's agent-based. So the basic idea is agents. There are 2 flavors of agents, a full agent and what we call micro-agent, which have less memory requirements. But the basic idea is agents will elect a leader, which knows about all the things that are connected to it in its own fog. And it's a very hierarchical architecture. So this was chosen because it's easy for us to get a view by just querying the leader, saying, what devices do you have in your fog? And it then has a list that it can readily produce. And each leader has a backup. If the leader goes down, the backup will take over. And if both of them go down, then they will renegotiate and find a new leader. And the leader will then start gathering information from its fog area again and reestablish its database. So building on this platform, it then makes it easier for people to build applications. before we go into that, we should just look at the basic security features, because usually a device, whether it's a phone, whether it's a Raspberry Pi, whether it's a high performance computing thing in the cloud, will have one agent. And they can communicate with each other. They will have a lifetime. We generate a random device ID. So if a phone appears again in a new fog, we can say, oh, we've seen you before. It's all based on PKI, public key infrastructure. So we get certificates to devices. They generate their own keys, and the CA sits in the cloud, and devices will connect out to the cloud and get certificates on their first connection. So we don't really want to give internet access to devices that just appear in the fog. So there's a gateway that lets a device connect out to just get a certificate and nothing else. And then once it's connected, we can choose to give it wider access to the internet. If there are devices that can't handle certificates, our approach is typically to connect it to a device that can, using a private network. So on the boats, for example, they have CAN buses that measure temperature in the motors and whatever. And these will typically connect into a device such as similar to a Raspberry Pi, which is able to do the encryption or whatever it is needed and onward communication. If we now zoom in on an agent, there's loads and loads of stuff in there. And most applications will not need all of these things, but applications will be able to build on these features, and as the application expands, they can make use of more and more of the features. And many of the things are actually really useful, like having a GUI or having monitors or having a quality of service that you say my stuff needs. And like the quality of service, there's also a quality of protection. You classify data to its protection levels. And there are libraries to support encrypting data to the correct levels. So if we now return to the challenges I mentioned, the first of them was the trust. Why should I trust this whole infrastructure? Well, first of all, the PKI helps establish trust, the certificates, the keys, because every device has its own key. So devices that are compromised can have their keys revoked. We can have distinct PKIs for applications. So a compromise of the infrastructure doesn't affect the application security and vice versa. And because the CA sits in the cloud, then it's shared between the fogs. So if you had a fog in the airport and you had a fog in the local station, they share the trust infrastructure through the PKI. So even if they can't communicate directly with each other, they can route stuff via services in the cloud, like MQTT, for example, and still be able to talk to each other. So if you're a parent at home and your child is traveling in the airport, you will know where they are because you can have permission to monitor their devices. The security classification for data we chose was quite simple: public for unprotected data, protected for integrity protected, which means that it's not secret, but it does have to not be tampered with, like an endpoint or something that is actually sensitive in the sense of if an attacker were to tamper with it, they could compromise security, so we protect it. And private then is for personal data, so that's encrypted and can be signed as well. The other challenge was the legacy devices out there. For us, it's not so much an issue because we're building new devices, so we don't really worry so much about the legacy, but often we need to share networks with legacy devices. So we did some early work on botnet detection, where we said if there is a botnet detection, we can at least isolate the incident using machine learning technologies. I must admit we haven't had time to finish this work because we've had other pressing priorities, but the early demonstrators were actually quite promising. So we were able from the leader to control firewalls and close off suspicious parts of the network to be able to isolate and protect the rest of the network. So a challenge here is the airport. If you think of an emergency, somebody says, oh, I need to get help. you need to distinguish that from an attack. So that's where the machine learning stuff comes in. Building on an existing platform makes it easier to develop applications, but you often get a low TRL on some of the components because they are being developed by students, and you need to make sure that they have a high technology level before you can use it in production. But then there are components that have a very high technology readiness level. And in a way, having a slightly hacky platform in places makes it easier to develop applications because the barrier is lower. And finally, on the future, you get updates. It's all continuous deployment and continuous integration on devices. So we have Raspberry Pis with Docker installed. Phones obviously get through the phone application. We did try to look at hardware, but again, we ran out of time. And with that, thank you very much.
Thank you, Jens, for that. That was certainly very interesting. I certainly took a lot of insight and information from that, and I'll have a further look at that. Now, let's dive straight into the talk of our next presenter, Dr. Pasquale Nicino from the Create IoT project. He will talk to you about the LSP program and privacy and security in IoT. Pasquale, the screen is yours.
Again, Pasquale, please unmute yourself.
Okay, now you should be able to hear me, right? Okay, thank you very much for giving me the floor, and it's great to be with you here today. So my presentation is exactly about the LSP program on privacy and security in IoT, and I will basically introduce what we have been doing in the context of the Create IoT project. Now, I have basically four main points. I will give you, because I assume that there might be people which don't even know what the LSP program is about. So in short introduction to the LSP program, then the relevance of privacy and security in this context, then some guidelines, or I will make reference to some documents that after the meeting, maybe some of you with an interest on it will be willing to consult, and then some of the IoT challenges which we can highlight. And of course, after my speech, we will have the Q&A session. So what is the LSP program? The LSP program and the LSP projects are different sets of projects financed by the European Union in our case. That, as you can see, as the slide says, are cooperating to foster the deployment of the Internet of Things solution in Europe through integration of advanced IoT technologies across the value chain, demonstration of multiple IoT applications at scale in a usage context as close as possible to operational condition. Now, what are these projects dealing with? So we have a project which is called Synchronicity, which is about basically smart cities. So it's a reference zone in cities. Smart living environments for aging well, which is basically e-health. Wearables for smart ecosystems. Internet of food, smart farming and food security, and then we have autonomous vehicles in a connected environment. In the web page of the LSP program, be enough for you to Google it, you will find all the link to the functioning websites of all the different projects. So you will have access to all the public deliverables and more information about these projects. Some projects also have tools available in marketplace and so on. For instance, Synchronicity has developed a privacy app for smart cities, which is already available in the different stores. So basically the websites of the projects are a gateway to have an access on what these projects have produced so far. And these are here in these slides. You can find the name of the different projects which are ActiveAge, IOF 2020, Monica, Synchronicity, Autopilot, and then we have two coordination and support actions which have been with IoT and then new for IoT. Also on the website of Create IoT and U4IoT, you can find different tools and deliverables available. The LSPs have, of course, worked across different verticals, but they also have worked at horizontal level to address specific issues which concern all the different kinds of IoT deployments. For instance, in my case, I have shared the activity group 5, which you can see here in the slides on the left side, which has been dealing with the trusted IoT, privacy, security, and legal framework. So having a legal background, this was really my area of action, really focusing on ethics and privacy in the context of the different LSPs, so horizontal and vertical solution in this sense. And this is particularly important because when you look at the relevance of privacy and security, you of course have to take into account mainly, of course, the GDPR, so the general regulation and legislation, which is applicable to all the different kind of vertical deployments. But then you have to also, of course, deal with the specific sectorial regulations, which widely differ. I mean, the kind of legislation that you have to apply to a smart city is not the same that you apply to health. And on this case, you already can have one fundamental insights that you have to take into account when you start considering privacy and security in IoT, in the sense that you need people who are really qualified, of course, horizontally, but very, very strong also on the different verticals. Somebody who is strongly qualified to act as, for instance, as a DPO in a smart city will not be necessarily qualified to act as a DPO or a consultant in the case of e-health. So you really need to take into account this horizontal and vertical dimension of know-how that you need to have in your own organization when you are going to tackle issues of privacy and security. We have, with collaboration of the different LSPs, produced some documents and framework which might be useful for even for those of you who not necessarily have a background in law but want to understand more of the also technological implication of the law, because law has an effect also on how our engineers or our developers work. So Create IoT has already published. This is available on the Create IoT website if you Google it. Deliverable 5.5. This was already published in 2017, which is the IoT Legal Framework. This is the table of content that you can find, where you have really a mapping of all the most relevant IoT legal solutions and implication for an IoT deployment. Now, this deliverable has been updated, and an updated version will be published and released in January. So in 1 month's time, we're just finalizing the new IoT legal framework. So this is one of the key fundamental deliverables for Create IoT. And at the same time, with the help of the activity group 5, which has seen the collaboration of the different activity groups, but also of other specialists involved, we are finalizing a document which is titled LSP's Good Practice on IoT Deployments. This document will be presented in Brussels during the next CPDP conference in January, which, if I'm not wrong, is from January 22nd to January 24th. So those of you that will be in Brussels those days are welcome to join us in the presentation of this other deliverable. Now, some of you might have recently seen this FBI warning concerning IoT deployments. And basically, if you read the document which has been published by the FBI, there was a whole series of suggestions to really keep your IoT deployment secure. And this is due to an increased concern. This was pretty clear in a recent study published by the Pew Center, where many Americans said that they were feeling not secure with IoT deployments, or especially as far as their privacy was concerned. There has been really a change of humor in this, especially in the US. This has profound market implications, because if people will not trust how different IoT devices, deployment and solution handle their data and their security, basically those the tools and devices will not have a market. This is why it's so important to stress this. Usually when I act as a consultant, I always say you don't have to comply with the law just for the sake of compliance. I understand that lawyers are often perceived like those who you tell us what to do, but this is not really technically important for us. You are stopping us from doing innovation and so on. But the reality of the fact is that we need to look at compliance and data protection and security as a market phenomenon. If you are not able to guarantee data protection and security, end users will not trust IoT solution and deployments. And this is the way through which we have to look at one fundamental IoT societal challenge, I would say. I just want to give you some suggestions on the work that we have been doing. So first of all, look at horizontal and vertical challenges, which are not necessarily the same, and in order to tackle them, you need different expertise. When you look at data protection, you have to look at, of course, legal, but also financial risk, and often legal risk imply financial risk. When you're looking to guarantee compliance, it will not be a checking box exercise. You need continuous improvement. This is not something that you do once and then it's done. You need to constantly monitor your compliance. In order to do so, education within your organization is key. You need to have the staff in your organization which really has a know-how on the relevance of this, not only one single department. And then, of course, in order to do so, you need to anticipate the evolution and user perception. And we have seen in recent years a shift in the perception of users as far as privacy and data protection and security are concerned. So my time, I think, is over. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Pasquale, for that. It was certainly very interesting. We have one question that I would like to answer, and that is IoT devices are generally low cost. Isn't that a challenge for ensuring high quality cybersecurity? Jens, can you answer that?
Yeah, so it's a very good question. It depends. So you can buy little chips that can do certificate stuff with elliptic curve cryptography, and they cost $6. And if those things are expensive for you, if you're building a boat, they're not expensive. If you're building a light bulb, then they are expensive. So yes, for the really cheap devices, it is a challenge. I think the most promising thing is that microcontrollers get cheaper and smaller and more capable. So in principle, you could have a microcontroller sitting with your network interface that is able to handle the security part of it. The challenge there then becomes, how do you update this key? How do you, if you look at something like how DVDs, Blu-ray are implemented, so they have a key system where they can revoke keys in individual players. And you may be able to do something like that for a microcontroller, but it is correct. It is a challenge for the really ubiquitous cheap devices. There has been quote unquote solutions from the industry as well that have looked at this. So I mentioned briefly Azure Sphere as one of the hardware solutions where they over a lifetime of 10 years, they let a microcontroller update its firmware and its security stack over from a service in the cloud. So things like this might change the prospect a bit, but we are a long way from having a standard, and it is still an issue. So it's a very good question.
Yes, thank you, Jens. And with that, I'd like to go further in our agenda and call for Antonio to give us an overview for the Anastasia projects on dynamic security management of distributed IoT scenarios. Antonio?
Yep. Hi. Can you see my slide now?
Yes, we can see your slide.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so basically, first of all, thanks for inviting us, in this case, the project Anastasia, to present here on this webinar. So I think it's quite a nice scenario also to share the results that we are achieving as part of the project. So basically, just to mention, Anastasia is a EU project in this case that we are almost arriving to the end of the project. Indeed, now we are preparing here the final demos and all the integration activities that are related to the project. As you can see, Anastasia is covering different industrial partners, academia, and SMEs. So basically what we are trying to demonstrate in that sense is that we are able to produce some kind of new technology that are able to be deployed, as you will see later, on different kind of scenarios, and how to make security a more, I would say, the first order component or enabler on the different kind of solution that where IoT and in general cyber physical system are part of the ecosystem in some sense. Basically, Anastasia has three main, I would say, objective as part of the design. First of all, is to design a security development, I would say, approach that take into account the dynamicity that we are having on the new kind of a scenario where mostly IoT are embedded in some sense. Because of that, what we want is to have you will see later, the general framework that is provided in Anastasia is based on security frameworks, so based on policies, so that at the end we want to describe basically what are the security properties that we want to have in a system, and based on this being able to deploy in a dynamic way, as you will see later, using technologies like SDN, NFB, etc. This security requirement or properties based on different enablers that could be available on certain moment on your installation, so that they can be deployed on the different components or networks that you are having as part of your system in that sense. So that's why the second main point is about the distributed architecture. So you will see later that we have several components that that can be deployed in different parts of the network that can cope with different kind of properties or needs on the security. And as I already said, all of them being governed in some sense by policies that indicate what to deploy, how to mitigate possible threats in that sense. And also, one of the important things we additionally want is to be able to in the future go able to learn in that sense the reactions that already have been realized, and based on this, being able to modify the kind of mitigation actions that already have been applied to solve certain problems. And the third element is what we call the holistic security, dynamic security and privacy seal. That in some way is also something that we see that is missing most of the situation when we are talking about cybersecurity and security deployment and privacy deployment on installations. Is basically how to provide some kind of feedback to, in this case, the security manager, or it could be the DPO if we're talking about the privacy, about the status of the security, what is or from the privacy, and the reason why that security now is being altered or modified based on possible threats that are happening on the system. So based on this, being able to monitor that information and also identify what have been the reactions in order to mitigate the possible, I would say, threat that already have happened. So at the end, the idea is to have a real-time monitoring, basically, a mechanism that help the designer or the decision maker in order to understand what things are working, why is the problem, and how to try to cope in the future about new decision, I would say. Obviously, all the projects, as already was said, is quite influenced by the idea of the need of solve the issue of IoT deployment. As you know, one of the main issues regarding with the IoT is that they are introducing a lot of new vectors, attack vectors, and just because of different circumstances. In some cases, because I mean, there are less update on the firmware. In other cases, because they introduce a lot of new coding errors, because we're talking about many kind of device with many different manufacturers. And linking to the previous question, I think one of the main issues is that because normally our chip devices, all the security aspects are not taken completely into account in that sense. So that's why it's important also the objective of the Commission and in Europe to try to have some kind of labeling of the security, so that we can get more confidence about the devices that we are using on our home, or either for health environment and this kind of attack. So anyway, so this kind of device introduce a lot of new, I would say, issues, and we need to be able to dynamically able to react, as I already said, to the different kind of new attacks that happen here. So that's why Anastasia, as I already said, try to identify new kind of cyber attacks that can happen regarding IoT, and being able to react and dynamically provide solutions that try to mitigate, in that sense, the possible threats that are happening in this case on the deployment, in that sense. Specifically, when we are talking about, as I already said, that in some cases it's not to think about one individual attack, but it's more about a concatenation of different attacks that are happening, maybe from different points and different entities that are a part of your infrastructure in some sense. So you need to take into account this scenario in order to be able to react in a right way, in that sense. Obviously, as I already mentioned, there are new type of attacks, specifically in the case of IoT, that need to be taken into account. One of them is the typical slow denial of service, that is totally different from the classical denial of service. And in order to that, what we need already, as I already mentioned, our approach is to try to solve this with the possibility to have a dynamic deployment of security enablers that can using the technologies like SDN, NFV, and also in our case with the introduction of new components in that sense, like IoT controller, that are in charge of providing this kind of security enablers linked to the solution of the IoT environment in that sense. So basically, this is the general scenario we are trying to cope with. So in our case, we are working with different scenarios. The scenarios that we are envisioning here is typically, for example, the case of the BMS or a kind of building management system that is under attack in that sense, where basically different kind of sensors, think about temperature or humidity or fire alarms, can be modified or can be attacked, and that could really create a situation that could be dangerous in the case of the building in that sense, or either the BMS, the building management system, as a system as such, that also can maybe affect, for example, the HVAC system, modify, for example, the change of the oxygen, for example, on certain rooms. So there are several issues there that need to be taken into account, and there is a plethora of different sensors already deployed in the building in that sense. Other cases, for example, the typical scenario of the MEC. Think about the camera. All of you know the famous attack also with these cameras that attacked the DNS many years ago. And the point here is how to control basically and identify that certain kind of misbehaving is happening on this kind of a device. It could be a camera, but also could be an IoT in that sense. So basically, the way to solve this by Anastasia is basically what you can see here. We have created a closed loop procedure, basically that start from the security, what we call security policies, basically where you describe what you want to have as a security properties of your system. Based on this is being this is being taken by the security orchestrator plane that take this and understand based on the knowledge about your infrastructure, which are the best elements of your infrastructure that need to be used, and what is the kind of enablers that can be deployed there. For example, if you're talking about a router, if you want to have a firewall, what kind of firewall you can deploy there. In another case, for example, we have a honeynet that need to be deployed just to try to identify certain kind of attacks. So basically, is to know what are the components that you have, what are the different infrastructure that you have, and based on this, make a orchestration of the right and most adequate component to be deployed there. And then it's the enforcement. Basically, is where basically we go and finally, sorry. The real enablers are being deployed using, as I already mentioned, technologies like SDN, like NFV, like the IoT controller that I already mentioned. Some of these enablers could be monitoring component, for example, just to try to understand what is happening on the network. And based on this monitoring, we are collecting data. That this data allow us, as you can see here, to try to identify possible attacks, possible incidents, making some kind of correlation, and based on this, take decisions, take a reaction that will be a mitigation plan that will try to cope with this kind of attacks or possible threats that is happening there in that sense. mitigation attacks that could be a collection of different policies that need to be applied. It's not just one action, but it could be a concatenation of different actions. For example, to put a firewall, to deploy a honeynet, to filter a concrete traffic, etc. So basically several things that need to be put on place. And finally, as I already mentioned, one important thing is to provide evidence to the managers about what already is happening, what is the different change in the situation, so that he can have a monitor tool that allow him to take future decision and maybe modify, as you can see here, the use playing with new policies that he will apply in the future to try to be more have a response that is more adequate to the problem. As a main key innovation, as you can see here, I mean, I'm not going to go into detail, but we already have worked. This is a RIA project, but I think the good thing is that we already have a very, I would say, the framework that already is able to show most of the functionality that we are proposing. But basically, as a research challenge, as you can see here, we already have demonstrated basically how the policies are able to be used for this global management of the solution. As I already said, not only for the security description of the property you want, but also for the mitigation action, for the reaction actions, and also to the with the idea to be able to have a flexible framework to allow you to have different kind of instantiation based on the general description of the policies that you want to apply. We have investigated, obviously, innovative cyber threats, as I already mentioned, specifically focused on the case of the IoT. We have defined this security orchestrator that is a new component that try to take into account different the resources, the enablers, and based on this take the most appropriate decision based on trying to optimize the deployment scenario that you can have on your infrastructure in that sense. And as already said, and one other important thing is already said is that we already have developed some kind of behavioral analysis that allow us to identify certain kind of anomaly behavior, and based on this, we can identify certain kind of attacks that in other way they could not be possible to be detected just by a simple vector, but basically because on a small change that are happening over the time. Or maybe, for example, in the case of the sensor on the temperature, we try to identify sensors that are starting to have a drizzling of their behavior in relation to others that are similar on the same environment. And that's give an alert. That doesn't mean that there is an attack, but allow us to try to do a mitigation action that maybe could be to filter that sensor until it is being finally evaluated, for example, in that sense. And finally, as I already mentioned, we have this secure and automatic seal system that is being carried out. So here you can see, I mean, I'm not going to explain in detail. There's several deliverables that you can find on the website where you can see basically in detail the different components. As you can see here, it's a quite complex or populate architecture with different components that are facing different aspects of the problem. But the important thing is what you can see here is that we cover, as I already mentioned, from the user side to describe the policy to the security orchestration with a collection of enablers that are already available that you can use, and it's dynamic. It's a database with different possibilities that you can use depending on your infrastructure. Then the security orchestrator that allow you to make the deployment. Finally, the enforcement that take into account, as you can see here, different kind of technologies. And finally, obviously, the monitoring issues that allow you to do analysis, filtering, detection, correlation, and finally the provision of a possible mitigation action based on existing and predefined patterns. But also the main idea, as I already mentioned, is to be able to learn and identify possible new threats that will imply to generate possible different mitigation in the future based on the feedback received by the security manager in that sense. So this is basically what you can see here. I mean, the deployment, the monitoring, the detection, the alert identification, finally the decision making, and finally the mitigation in this case, or the remedy that you can apply in order to try to cope with that. The good and the important thing here is all this solution is dynamic, as I already mentioned, is completely on real time, so that we concatenate all the flows, all the interactions, so that we can have a very, flexible solution that is able to cope with different kind of incidents and can be applied to different scenarios. I mean, the two scenarios that we are envisioning and we were testing as part of the final demo are not the only one, because at the end, this is a framework that we are having in that sense. So just to conclude, I mean, just it's an example. I don't think that it's necessary, because also we are going out of time. But basically, it's an example that you can see later here about possible detection of a manipulation of a sensor, and because of this, there are some attacker that want to gain control of a critical temperature sensor, and based on this, we need to be able to identify this as a change on the behavior, and based on this, we need to apply certain actions over the infrastructure in order to stop and control basically the possible attack with different kind of components that you can see here we are applying, from OpenFlow SDS, PANA network authentication, brokers, and different other actuation. So just to conclude in the set, so Anastasia, as you can see already here, is basically is taking very different kind of a scenario. We put some of them like smart buildings, smart cities, and this kind of stuff, but it's in general a framework that is basically on a policy orchestration of how you want to deploy and manage the incidents on your infrastructure in some sense. And for that is relaying on using technologies that allow a dynamic behavior or dynamic reaction basically to this kind of needs, using technology like SDN, like NFV, and obviously taking into account, as already mentioned, that one of the key elements that we want to preserve and try to securize is basically the case of the IoT networks and the management basically of this kind of deployment in that sense. As we already said, based on this, we already have identified and we raised several challenges that we already been faced at Anastasia, and this is, I would say, one of the second aspect I already mentioned. We are not only defining the framework, we are not only generating components that try to cope, but also we have identified and we have worked on concrete research challenges that appear on this kind of a scenario that we understand also have provided, in our case, different publications to show up that we are going beyond the state of the art on the technology and how this solution can be applied on this kind of complex scenario that we already are trying to envision in that sense. And that's all for my side. Here you can see basically our website and any, as you know, apart from the possible question now, any future interest, you can go there and get in contact with us. Thanks.
Thank you, Antonio, for that. It was certainly a very interesting presentation. I'd like to hand over directly to Anastasia for the cyberwatching.eu project to give us an overview of the legal implications regarding GDPR and IoT.
Thank you very much, Michelle. My name is Anastasia Botsi, as very nicely introduced, and I will cover the aspects that we haven't spoken of yet, which is the legal components of IoT. And I will be doing so on behalf of our consortium of cyberwatching and ICT Legal Consulting, which is a firm based in Italy and Amsterdam, specializing in ICT matters and legal consulting. Before we dive into the more technical components, I would just like to give 3 definitions that are necessary so we can all be on the same page. Personal data is basically includes an identified or identifiable natural persons, and that means that even though someone might not be directly identified, so that means their name or their last name, if they can be identified through any other reference or mental, economic, or social component related to that person, then it is still considered personal data. Then we have the 2 roles which are important in the processing, which is the data controller, which is the company that determines the purposes and the means of the processing, and the data processor, which is the company that basically is instructed to carry out the processing on behalf of the controller. And lastly, processing is a very wide definition under the GDPR, so even if it doesn't actually include adapting or collecting personal data, but merely storing it or transmitting it, it is also considered processing. So this is a very important definition to keep in mind. As mentioned previously, very to the point by Pascal, we see that the GDPR is more of a game changer for businesses, and it gives rise to 2 points: accountability and security measures. Under the GDPR, accountability essentially means that data controllers have a responsibility to ensure through technical measures and organizational measures, but also to demonstrate their compliance. And that means showing it to the outer world and making sure that it's not only internal, but it's also externally reflected. Within ICT Legal Consulting, we've come up with a simplified approach to data protection, and it all starts from accountability and it ends at accountability, because this is the basic principle, the core principle, which the entire legislation is built upon. So using accountability as a start, the most important component of accountability is data protection by design and by default, which essentially means that at any time that your project, whenever it starts, whenever something changes, data protection must be implemented in the design stages, so in the initial stages, but also whenever anything changes or alters, it needs to be done by default. So protection of the data subject should not be an option. It should always be there as an option of a default case. And by applying this principle, we arrive at the data protection impact assessment, which is essentially a risk assessment that should always be conducted when the risk to data subjects is high. This data protection impact assessment should give rise to the appropriate security measures which must be implemented to mitigate the risk or to simply lower the risk. And hopefully also a data breach management procedure will be implemented, even very basic process. Of course, a framework on data protection would not be complete without informing the data subjects and ensuring that a complete and legitimate legal basis is chosen. And lastly, we must ensure that the rights of the data subject are able to be exercised. Of course, there is many opportunities in the digital era, but we also have to take a look at the concerns, because there is a large amount of connected devices. In fact, Gartner predicts that by 2020 there will be 2 billion connected devices around the world, which of course makes us think of these concerns and makes these concerns even more important, because we need to sort out a method and a good approach for tackling these concerns. The biggest concern, of course, comes forth with the principle of data protection by design and by default. The reason being is that IoT devices are...
Sorry, Anastasia, your slides are not showing. Should we keep it up? Should we?
I will try to use the main screen. Is this working now?
Yes, now yes, perfect.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Apologies for that. Hopefully you'll be eager to follow now. So as I was saying, data protection by design and by default is a problem within IoT, because the devices themselves are quite intrusive by nature. Not all of them, but many of them. That means that a data protection impact assessment is instrumental for compliance, because it will not only help you understand the risks, but it will also help you understand what privacy measures must be taken. Of course, we could not move forward without mentioning the risk-based approach, which of course becomes extremely tricky when there is hundreds or thousands of devices deployed around the world. That means that some security and organizational measures may be different or may not be as proportionate to the risk, depending on the region or on the data that is collected or stored. And that makes data breach management very serious. And as most of you know, under the GDPR, the companies have 72 hours to communicate to the relevant supervisory authority from the moment they become aware of an incident, which means that a process must be there 100% stipulated. Moving on, the next concern is transparency. How can IoT devices ensure that they inform the customer in a useful and significant way? And that does not only mean informing them in the beginning when they start using the device, but the controller needs to also find a way of informing them or alerting them when changes occur on how their data is being processed. Of course, one component which needs to be seriously evaluated together with the risk assessment is the security measures that can be implemented. And within the IoT environment, defining and implementing these security measures becomes especially tricky due to the vertical and horizontal components, as very well said by Pascal earlier. And what we can offer in terms of this is, in order to find a balance between what is necessary for the domain and also for the different environment that the IoT devices may be employed, is use ENISA's baseline security recommendations, which essentially cover a major vertical applications area of IoT, and at least give a starting point of where can we start when we think about security for IoT. We could not talk about compliance without mentioning the risks that are posed for companies and startups, or even smaller and medium enterprises, because the GDPR gives actually a lot of rights to the data subjects to take action against companies when they believe that they have not been complying with their rights and they have not been offering their rights. And that doesn't only give rise to fines, which is the most obvious and clear violation and punishment, but it can also give rise to legal action. It can give rise to class actions, as we've seen. A lot of court cases are pending right now of class actions. And that can also have reputational damage as well as financial damage. So in conclusion, even though there are a lot of serious challenges within the IoT and the GDPR field, we see it more as an opportunity for manufacturers and the network operators to work together and build privacy into the design of these IoT devices. Of course, risk assessment needs to be a core element of your privacy practices and compliance journey, and you can use the ENISA's definition of baseline security measures as a starting point. Deep data protection impact assessments, or DPIAs as we call them, are extremely relevant and very helpful tools. There is a free tool by the French Data Protection Authority that you can use. It's an open software that can be used to conduct these data protection impact assessments and to help you adopt data breach management policies. The two things that need to be kind of a bit more innovative are the ways with which you can adequately inform your data subjects. And this is it really varies depending on what type of IoT device we're talking about. But this is a serious concern that must for sure be tackled in one way or another. And lastly, but not least, also, hopefully in the near future, we will see relevant certifications that can demonstrate compliance or privacy seals that will help you adhere to and also show your compliance to the outer world. Within Cyberwatching, in fact, we have a deliverable that we've published some months ago. It is an online tool that can help businesses understand the risk of GDPR-related sanctions. Essentially, you just answer a couple of questions and you get a recommendation report at the end, which shows basically your gaps in your compliance journey. So we would be happy for you to check out our temperature tool, and hopefully you find it useful, and we welcome any feedback on it. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to receiving your questions.
Thank you, Anastasia, for that. That was certainly very interesting. I've personally gone through the GDPR temperature tool and got quite some good and useful recommendations. And in fact, where I thought that I had covered my bases, I didn't. So there's certainly something for me to do, and I can only recommend that tool for you to go through. It's really not that difficult to do. We have one question, and I would like Jens to answer that, and that is, of course, IoT and the most recent hubbub and hype and discussions around quantum supremacy. And specifically, what would be the implications of the recent development in quantum computing on IT cybersecurity?
So very briefly, if you're interested in the topic, then if you search for NIST post-quantum cryptography, that's NIST, post-quantum cryptography, then you can find a good resource page on the topic where they're looking for algorithms that would survive a quantum computing attack. In the terms of IoT devices, you may find that devices cannot update their algorithms. So either the algorithms get desupported and the device stops working, or the device gets hacked, or both. So again, it's really a call to arms for being able to update the IoT device firmware.
Yes, I think that's a very good point to be made, which is, I think, this whole problem space of updating millions of devices is a very challenging, and you already see this smart devices, smart TVs, and things like that. The era or the need for update of systems is at very least a driver for always on items and always on devices, which is ever more needed in IoT.
Yeah, and we're seeing browsers de-support algorithms already, so it becomes an issue.
Yes, I see that. Thank you very much. And with that, Julie, can you make me presenter for the final slides, please? All right, thank you very much for that. So, in conclusion, we have heard a lot about very hardware-focused or very device-focused project results from the MF2C project, which was for me quite interesting to hear. Certainly the application of machine learning for automatic fault control and furthermore protection. Create IoT was looking into the legal frameworks, and I was just wondering how this would apply certainly for drones, because here in the UK, just in November, new legislation applied for drone operators to have certain education and be registered in order to be able and allowed to operate drones. Then we move on looking at Anastasia. I was very interested to see that there are behavioral analytics coming into place, and the cognitive the reaction to various different threats that come into the system. And last but not least, as I mentioned, the application of GDPR in the IoT area, where devices can be very intrusive in people's personal and private life, and where the convenience of systems trumps over security and privacy protection is certainly a real threat and a real issue that needs to be tackled and addressed. But this is while this is also a technical issue, it's first and foremost, I think, it's also a societal and governmental question, how this is going to be addressed in the various different societies across the world. And with that, let me introduce you to a couple of new further events on this in this area. Some of you, or many of you, might be interested in joining our cybersecurity community. And with that, the European Commission is working on a new proposal for a cybersecurity taxonomy that is different, but in certain terms compatible to our cyberswatching.eu research taxonomy. A new version of it came out. If you're interested, please have a look at the cyberwatching.eu website, where we make reference to that. Next, the upcoming cyberwatching event is on cybersecurity services and tools for SMEs. Which will address how SMEs that don't have much budget for IT or let alone the people and the skills for that, for easy to use tools and services that come from EU funded projects to deploy within the organization. On as far as I get it, it's the 28th and 29th and 30th of January in 2020. So perfect timing to be refreshed after your holiday break. The next one is the second cyberwiser.eu open pilots workshop, where you can have a look at to train yourself, train your staff, look and learn about cybersecurity threats and attacks. And best of all is it's free. And of course, Lille is a wonderful city in France, and it's always worth a visit for you to learn and to watch and to enjoy good French cuisine. And with that, I like you for your attention. I thank you for your attention. I thank the panelists for the information. We will make the slides available on the website, on the webinar website, as well as any further links that or search terms that our panelists have given you. With that, thank you for your attention. I hope you have learned as much as I did, and hopefully see you in our next webinar. And with that, thank you and have a nice day.